2022 Neustadt Lecturers. I welcome all of you who were able to brave the cold here in Oklahoma City to attend the lectures today in person, and welcome also to all of you who are joining us online on the webinar. We're so glad that you are with us. As is our tradition with this and our other lecture series, we will begin this time with a brief time of scripture and song before we welcome this year's lecturer, Dr. Kristine Henriksen Garroway. This is our usual chapel time here at Oklahoma City University, and so this is the way we have usually begun.
A reading from Psalm 127, a song of ascents of Solomon. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who built it labor in vain. Unless the Lord guards the city, the guard keeps watch in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for the Lord gives sleep to the Lord's beloved. Children are indeed a heritage from the Lord, and the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the offspring of one's youth. Happy is the one who has a quiver full of them, who shall not be put to shame when speaking with enemies in the gate.
A reading from Proverbs 17:6. Grandchildren are the crown of the aged, and the glory of children is their parents. A child's prayer from the Children's Defense Fund. Dear Lord, be good to me. The sea is so wide, and my boat is so small. In closing, an excerpt from Psalm 133:1. How very good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity.
Walter and Dolores Neustadt of Ardmore, Oklahoma, established the Neustadt Lectures at Oklahoma City University in 1983 for the purpose of strengthening understanding of the great contributions of the Judaic religious tradition to Western civilization and thought. We invite scholars to the campus annually for this lecture series to speak on informative themes in the areas of Hebrew scriptures, Judaic thought, and Jewish ethics and art. One of the comments on Walter Neustadt's obituary page stated, "Everything Walter did in Oklahoma and his tremendous legacy will forever speak loudly." We at OCU, and especially in the Wimberley School of Religion, are grateful for the gift of Walter and Dolores Neustadt and the way it continues to speak loudly as a powerful force for education in the Oklahoma City community. Today, we are delighted to welcome this year's lecturer, Dr. Kristine Henriksen Garroway. Dr. Garroway has been at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion's Skirball campus in Los Angeles since 2011, serving as visiting assistant professor of Bible. She received her doctorate in Hebrew Bible and Cognate Studies at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion's Cincinnati campus in 2009. She has spent time studying and researching in Israel and has participated in excavations at Ashkelon, Tel Dor, and Tel Dan. Garroway's scholarship focuses on children. She is a leader in the new methodology of childist biblical interpretation, innovating, developing, and fostering the use of archaeology and texts to reveal the previously hidden children of ancient Israel and Mesopotamia. She has published in various scholarly journals and is a regular contributor to thetorah.com. Garroway's most recent book is Children and Methods, Listening to and Learning from Children in the Biblical World, co-edited with John W. Martins in 2020, and our own Dr. Sharon Betzworth is also a contributor to that volume. My students and I read and discussed one of her articles in that book this week and were fascinated by her insights. Her book, Growing Up in Ancient Israel, Children in Material Culture and Biblical Texts, published in 2018, received the Biblical Archaeological Society's 2019 Publication Award for Best Book Relating to Hebrew Bible. Today, we are so delighted to welcome Dr. Garroway as our 2022 Neustadt Lecturer.
Thank you. The investigation of children in the biblical world requires answers to two deceptively simple questions. Who is a child, and where do we find them? Close your eyes. Now think of a child. It can be any child. Who did you see? Was it a friend, a relative, someone from TV, a movie, or a book? Why do you think this person came to mind? You might have picked this person unconsciously because you have certain associations with what children do and what we might expect of them. Now I will ask you a second question. Close your eyes again if you open them. Picture a child from the Bible. Now, who did you think of? Was it harder to come up with someone? You can open your eyes. I wonder how many people would think of young David wielding his slingshot or the infant Jesus wrapped in swaddling clothes. But did anyone think of Jephthah's daughter or Abraham's first son Ishmael? The biblical text is full of children, and finding them is akin to a literary game of hide and seek. However, to play this game requires knowing who qualifies as a child in the biblical world, and knowing how to look for them. These two questions are not new. The field of childhood archaeology has been addressing them for over 25 years. Paying close attention to the entirety of the archaeological record opens up new doors. Suddenly forgotten scraps of lithics, poorly made miniature vessels, and overlooked skeletal remains of children become a world where children created tools, played with toys, died from war, strenuous labor, and malnutrition. Yet it is only recently that the field of biblical studies has taken a similar interest in children. For biblical studies, answering who is a child in the Bible and where can children be found is a bit more difficult than it is for a society in which the evidence comes solely from archaeological realia. The complications are twofold. In the field of biblical studies, one must take into consideration how the child treated within the text may be different from the child found in the archaeological remains. Further complications develop because of the distance in time, geography, and culture. Views of who children were in the biblical world are much different than in our own. Due to these complications, answering these questions for the biblical world requires not just one, but many fields: biology, sociology, philology, art theory, and more. In my own work, I use an interdisciplinary approach called childist interpretation, combining many different kinds of data sets in order to examine children in the ancient world. Today, I will take you through some of these data sets to show you how different kinds of resources help add to our understanding of children in the biblical world. The first question that I posed was, who is a child in the biblical world? One might think to answer this question requires one to leave behind everything they know, behind all their perceptions of children in the Western world. And to some extent, this is correct. However, there is something universal about children in every culture. Biologically speaking, children are classified as children for a reason. They are immature humans. From a cultural standpoint, the sentiment in the opening visualization exercise is correct. A modern Westerner's understanding of what makes someone a child is much different than that of a person in the ancient Near East. It is at the intersection of biology and culture where one can find the best answer to who is a child. Since this is not a biology lecture, I'll keep my comments regarding the science behind human growth brief. Human growth is classified into 4 stages post-gestation: infancy, childhood, the juvenile stage, and adolescence. Based on these growth categories, biologically speaking, a child is an individual 3.1 to 6.9 years old. Yet when scholars say child, they are referring to more than individuals in this narrow biological age range. They are referring to infants, children, juveniles, and even at times adolescents. A study of any culture, ancient or modern, will quickly point out that there are multiple kinds of ages and stages in individuals who have not reached maturity. Another problem with defining children through biological categories alone is that biological categories are much neater than the lived life. While most individuals might double their birth weight by age 6 months and have ossified wrist bones by age 13, people learn to walk, talk, and perform and perfect different skill sets at different ages. Because people move from one category of life to another at varying times, individuals of different ages exist within a single category. For example, babies begin to crawl at different ages, some at 5 months, some at 13 months, yet they all belong to the social age of crawler. Ages within categories can also vary depending on the cultural situation. Consider the contemporary example of obtaining a driver's license and entering the social category of licensed driver. The social category driver and non-driver affects a person individually, but also those around them. For a teenager, being able to drive might mean freedom and separation from their family. If my research is correct, individuals in the state of Oklahoma apply for a license when they are 16 years old. However, there are individuals who, for various reasons, wait until they are older to get a license. The same thing is true for the ancient world. Different people went through different stages at different times. In fact, most cultures in the biblical world did not fixate on chronological age in the same way as we do today. Instead, social ages were used, and references to an individual's age often pertain to their relationship with other members of their society. For example, in nearby Mesopotamia, groups of people were recorded either as old, adult, adolescent, or child. At times, the youngest group, child, was further divided into adolescent, child, weaned child, or suckling child. The Hebrew Bible refers to individuals in much the same manner. The term child, then, is actually an umbrella category into which various social ages can be placed. In general, there seems to be an acknowledgement within the textual sources that individuals who are unmarried belong into this umbrella category. Once an individual marries, he or she moves into the category of adult. As is clear from this discussion, both an understanding of who is a child and social ages are constructs of individual societies. While there may be some similarities between children of unrelated societies, there are also differences. The examples given here have relied on general, relatable categories of young people. Yet some categories present in the ancient Near East are not present today, such as the category of initiate, found in Judges 8:20-21. In this narrative, Gideon's son Jether refuses to draw his sword to kill the enemy because he was afraid. The explanation given is that he was still a youth. Professor Stephen Wilson has explained Jether's actions, or lack thereof, as indicative of a boy who is not ready to become a man. Thus, initiate here can be understood as, quote, a young boy who is ready to transition into manhood when he is capable of killing the enemy, unquote. Such a category is not directly relatable to us in the Western world and points out the necessity of examining a social age in its historical setting. Determining who is a child is perhaps trickier than one would imagine, as one needs to consider both these biological constants and social constructs. Keeping in mind that children can be defined in many different ways, it is not only useful, but necessary to have language with which to discuss children. Therefore, I suggest that the answer to the first question, who is a child in the biblical world, is as follows. To speak of someone as a child in a non-relational way is to indicate a prepubescent individual. Those individuals who have reached puberty but are not married can be considered adolescents. Within the larger category of child, we can place smaller categories, such as infant or baby, young child, and older child. Now, on to our second question. Where do we find children? Children pervade the biblical world. Yet despite this rather obvious claim, children can remain hidden. They fall into that silent other category. I want to turn to some texts now to demonstrate ways in which close readings can help us recover children in the Bible. The most obvious place to find children in the Bible is in narratives that contain children. Stories like David and Goliath or little Samuel serving before the Lord are natural starting points. In such narratives, children play a main role and even speak. Less noticeable are places including passages where children are silent. These other texts might include narratives, poetry, or wisdom literature where children are referenced, but not necessarily the focus. To demonstrate the interplay between social age, literary genre, and issues in finding children in these less apparent places, I will use the births of Cain and Abel as starting points. Genesis 4:1 states that Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived, and she bore Cain. She said, I have gained a man, Hebrew word ish, with the Lord's help. Nowhere in the verse is there a word describing Cain as a baby or child. The only descriptive word is ish, the Hebrew for man. Since it is absurd to think that Eve bore a full-grown man, one must read ish, man, as a substitution for the Hebrew word zakar, meaning male. Here it must be inferred that Cain was born as a baby boy. Cain's story demonstrates the first hurdle in locating children in the text, namely that their early months and years are rarely recorded. Their lives as infants are not the main concern of the biblical text. True, there are terms for infants and young children in the Hebrew Bible, but the lived lives of these individuals have little to do with the agenda of the adult, elite, androcentric authors. This results in a text which includes children but does not focus on them. Therefore, in reading narratives, it becomes important to pay attention to the adults' attitudes regarding their children. For example, names can provide information about how children were understood. Names like Nathaniel, gift of God, or Joseph, may God add another, reflect the belief that the divine was in control of a child's existence. In addition to theophoric names, children may be given names from nature or names that reflect the parent's feeling about the birth. Consider Leah, who explains what luck upon the birth of a child, naming him Gad. Hannah too chooses to name her child based on her feelings regarding the child's birth. She calls him Samuel. I have asked the Lord for him. Such names reflect a child's value within the family. Since the Hebrew Bible narratives are generally about upper-class families, one must wonder whether the joy surrounding birth and infancy and the inferred value of children was widespread among the social classes. To answer this requires looking to other sources that mention children and infants. Both poetry and wisdom literature can help fill in these gaps. Psalm 127, 3-5a says, "Children are the inheritance of the Lord, the fruit of the womb. His reward, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, are children born to the man in his youth. Happy is the man who fills his quiver with them." The terms used here show how broadly some words can be interpreted. Paralleling children with fruit of the womb is a poetic device, but also helps us to understand that fruit of the womb, pre-beton, need not refer to a newborn. Children as an abstract concept are understood as a gift of the Lord, and people with multiple children should count themselves blessed. The poetic text of the latter prophets also adds to our knowledge of children as valuable to the family. While the passages do not describe the lives of children in detail, they do reference the loss of children, an event considered a tragedy for the family and the nation. These references to losing children almost all emerge in discussions surrounding two main themes: outcomes of war and effects of breaking the covenant. Consider that the latter prophets include 92 references to children, of which approximately 75 are references to the dismal fate of children during warfare. There are almost a dozen terms for children, which range from specific social ages, such as a suckling or toddler, to generic terms, such as a male or female child, or male or female youth. This array of terminology emphasizes the value of children to a society and society's need to protect these most vulnerable members. Jeremiah 6:11 states, "Pour it on the infant in the street, and on the company of youths gathered together. Yes, men and women alike shall be captured, elders and those of advanced years." So too, Isaiah 20, verse 4 says, "So shall the king of Assyria drive off the captives of Egypt and the exiles of Nubia, young and old, naked and barefoot, and with bare buttocks, to the shame of Egypt." These two passages illustrate the horrors of war befalling not just Israelite adults, but the helpless, innocent next generation of all nations, and again emphasizes the importance of paying attention to social ages when it comes to finding children. If the example of Cain's birth introduces a first hurdle, namely a child's early years are not often explicated at length, in fact, they may only be acknowledged obliquely by recognizing a social age, the birth of his brother Abel introduces a second hurdle. Genesis 4:2 records Abel's birth as followed. "Then she bore his brother Abel." The second birth brings with it the second hurdle, the use of relational terms. Sometimes children will be designated as a child by means of his or her connection to others in the family, using terms like son, daughter, sister, or brother. Again, it is context that will help the reader determine whether the individual is a child. For example, in pairing the terms son and daughter, it is often linked to a form of violence that results as an outcome of war. It could be cannibalism, an untimely death, captivity, or slavery. These terms are also used in accusations of child sacrifice, found in the legal and narrative portions of the Bible. Identifying the relational term, then, is only the first step. The next steps might require one to seek out how the term is used in the given context and in other contexts. Once this is done, one can look for patterns in how the terms are used. Consider another example. The terms brother and sister, when they are linked to other children or adolescents, are steeped in narratives including themes of protection and sibling rivalry. Knowing this can cue the reader into attitudes regarding sibling relationships, as well as parent and child relationships. In terms of birth order, the social ages Bekor, male firstborn, and Bekera, female firstborn, can be useful in identifying children and their relationship to the household vis-a-vis inheritance, instruction, and leadership among the siblings. When the term Bekor firstborn is employed, issues of primogeniture are usually at the forefront. The eldest son enjoys extra status, movable and immovable property, power over other sons, and when the father is unable, serves as the legal representative for females and younger males in the family. The pervasive motif of the younger son supplanting the elder weaves its way through many biblical narratives: Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, and yes, even Aaron and Moses. For females, the Bekera, the oldest daughter, is also an important role. Birth order is important for females when it comes to marriage. The eldest must marry before the youngest. Rachel must wait for Leah to be married, and Michal for Merab. The story of Lot's daughters suggests another role for the eldest daughter. Like Naomi, Lot's eldest daughter comes up with a plan for seducing a man, happens to be her father, and then provides instruction for a younger girl on how to carry out the plan. In this way, the elder daughter mimics the role of a mother figure who reaches out and teaches a younger girl. The remaining biblical Hebrew terms for children also have a relational aspect to them, as they represent social ages. The strapping youth, the Bachur, the girl of marriageable age, the Betula, the teenage girl, the Alma, the toddling or tripping one, the Taf, and the weaned child, the Gamul, are all stages in which a child must pass on his or her way to adulthood. Looking for these terms and other social ages categories mentioned above can be a start to identifying children in the biblical text. Recognizing that children are always almost talked around or about instead of to is another important point. Children, even more so than women, rarely have a voice in the biblical text. Yet, this need not deter one from uncovering them, for as feminist hermeneutics have proven, simply because a voice is silent does not mean that the voice has nothing to say. The biblical text was not written in a vacuum. It was highly influenced by the world around it. So for the next few minutes, I will share a little bit about children in one of the ancient Israel's closest neighbors, Mesopotamia. A Sumerian proverb states, "Marrying several wives is human, getting many children is divine." Like the Israelites, Mesopotamians also valued children. Unlike the Israelite tradition, the Mesopotamian tradition is replete with many kinds of textual sources that reference children. These cover, among other things, liturgical works, adoption contracts, sale contracts, lexical lists, fashion lists, incantations, epics, legal materials, and personal letters, a much broader corpus than we have from the Bible. I don't have time to go into the Mesopotamian corpus in depth, but I do want to point out that the cultures surrounding biblical lands also valued children and discussed them in their texts. I will offer just one example here of how children are hiding in a legal text. A sale document from the first millennium BCE concerns the sale of a little girl who is called a young daughter of 3 years old. The text gives the legal status, daughter, a social age, youngling, and a chronological age, 3 years old. In this case, 3 years old could be considered a nursing child, a weaned child, or simply a child. It appears, however, that this little girl has completed nursing some time ago because she is not called Pirsu, nursing child, but Sahirtum, a young child. Paying attention to little details, to terminology like this, can help uncover the children hidden in these texts. Embedded in this example is another important method critical to finding children in ancient Near Eastern materials: rethinking the way a text has previously been interpreted. Many texts, including the Hebrew Bible, have been interpreted for so long by scholars not looking for children. However, when one turns from an adult-centric to a child-centric reading strategy and stops to pay close attention to the text, it will see children hiding in plain sight. The material record of past societies also offers many different places to find children. I will be discussing archaeology later this afternoon and evening, so I will do just a little here. What I will say is that where the biblical text remains elusive and vague, we can turn to the archaeological record to help fill in these gaps. I like to use the image of a coloring book. If the biblical text gives us the outline, the archaeological remains provide the colored pencils. Through iconography, dwelling sites, and skeletal remains, we find a unique presentation of children that adds to our knowledge of children in the biblical world. For example, iconography uses height, gestures, and clothing to indicate differences in ages. In the Egyptian tomb of Beni Hassan, we see a procession of Semitic peoples, that is, peoples who come from the lands of ancient Canaan, coming to Egypt with their wares. This procession includes men, women, and children. The children are shorter, have different hairstyles, and different clothing. So too, we see in the Lachish reliefs a very stark picture of the Assyrian destruction of the Judean city Lachish after and in the year 701 BCE. After sacking the city, the Assyrian army took Judean families and deported them. Here we see forced migration, a topic so relevant today, also happening in the biblical world. And children were just as vulnerable then as today. They have witnessed the horrors of war and must endure a very long walk into a new land where they will settle down. We only see the start of their journey. We do not know the end of their story. Turning to excavations, we see that dwellings have produced items used as toys, nightlights, protective charms, and so much more, and I will talk about some of these later today. However, the skeletal remains, for their part, show a differentiation in the way that children were cared for in death. Infants were buried in jars in the house, while older children were often buried along with other members of the family outside of the house. We see then in the archaeological record ways in which society treated children differently, and ways in which the social ages determined this treatment. I will conclude with some observations. First, children in ancient societies are both similar to and different from children today. Biologically, children are pre-adolescent individuals who are still dependent upon adults. In this way, one might think of children on a spectrum. As individuals grow, they become less and less dependent upon the adults in their lives until they reach the point at which they could begin to produce and care for their own children. Just as contemporary society talks of children vis-a-vis social ages, toddlers, school-aged children, and preteens, so too did the biblical world. This first observation addressed my first question: who is a child? The second question I posed was, where do we find children? I have taken you on a tour of the biblical text and introduced you to other ancient Near Eastern texts and a few archaeological remains, by way of saying that children can be found in lots of places if we stop to look for them. We can mesh the data gleaned in the sources to get a sense of what a baby or a child might have looked like. Iconography, archaeological remains, and textual data can be combined to discern how social status and class affected the presentation of children in any given time and place. Part of a childist or child-centered methodology that looks for children acknowledges that previous work in the biblical world has predominantly been examined with an eye towards adults or institutions run by adults. Approaching a corpus of material to focus on finding children changes the information one can glean from the text, and this is part of the way forward. Through a process of combined approaches, we will be that much closer to finding children in the biblical world. So I will end with one more question. Now, if I were to ask you to close your eyes and picture a child, what do you see? I hope you see something different. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garroway, for your fascinating lecture, and I want to invite you all to join us downstairs for the next lecture, which begins at 2:30, will last until 3:45, and it will give us an opportunity for some question and answer time. I realized that I failed to introduce myself when I first came up, so I'm Dr. Lisa Wolf, professor of Hebrew Bible here at the Wimberley School of Religion. I'm so glad for all of you who have joined us in person and online today. And for those of you who will join us downstairs, an extra little perk is that we do have some warm beverages down there. So I hope you will join us and hear more and see some pictures on some really cool slides with artifacts from archaeology. So thank you again to Dr. Garroway and for all of you who've joined us here.